6 months ago, in front of the entire cafeteria, the head nurse called me a primitive terrorist and stomped on my prayer mat, telling me my kind confuses healing with harming. I stayed silent. Yesterday, without warning, she emptied her office in the middle of the night and disappeared without saying goodbye. Can you even imagine being mocked, belittled, and treated like dirt, all while holding a secret that would absolutely shatter the world's perception of you? Because that's exactly what happened to me, a chief surgeon from Syria, working as a janitor in an American hospital. I was mopping hallways just trying to get by, in a Midwestern hospital. And this head nurse, Clara, she decided I was her favorite target. With my thick accent and my janitor's uniform, I guess I looked exactly like what she expected from a Middle Eastern refugee who'd washed up in Cincinnati with nothing but the clothes on my back. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly fathom, was that I'd run the largest trauma center in Damascus for 15 years before the bombs started falling. One Tuesday morning, she really went for it. Clara loudly explained to the new residents that they should speak slowly around me because ACT probably doesn't understand complex English. Can you believe it? She then demonstrated by talking to me like I was 5 years old, asking if I knew how to properly clean the OR between surgeries, complete with exaggerated hand gestures. The residents laughed nervously as she pointed at my mop and said, "You push forward and back. Understand?" I just nodded silently. I had to. My medical license transfer was still pending, and the last thing I needed was to make enemies. I just hoped to rejoin my field soon. But the next day, during morning rounds, Clara deliberately knocked over her coffee right where I just finished cleaning. Then she stood there watching me get on my hands and knees to wipe it up. "At least you're good at something," she sneered, stepping over me. 20 minutes later, in the break room, Clara walked in with 3 other nurses, talking about ventilators. Then she stopped, looked at me, and asked if I even knew what the machines did, answering herself by saying I probably thought they were magic boxes. And then she added, "Where he comes from, they probably still use leeches and pray to Allah for healing." The laughs she got were even bigger this time. She escalated things during lunch. She found me eating hummus and pita in the supply closet. She took a picture and posted it on the hospital's message board with a caption, "Our janitor eating terrorist food in the closet like the rat he is." Within an hour, people walked past me, making explosion sounds and asking if I had a bomb in my lunch bag. When I tried to tell Clara her message was hurtful, she actually told me, "My kind shouldn't be allowed near medical facilities because we couldn't understand the difference between healing and harming." The next week, she brought nursing students to watch me work, using me as a cautionary tale. She'd point at my hands while I mopped and tell them how in Syria, we probably diagnosed illness by reading tea leaves and treated cancer with camel urine. She made me stand there while explaining that people from primitive cultures had different brain structures that made complex reasoning impossible. Then, she discovered I'd been watching surgery videos on my phone during my break. She snatched it, showed everyone, laughing about how I was probably getting off on watching real doctors work. She then, right in front of me, deleted my saved medical journals one by one, explaining that letting refugees near medical knowledge was dangerous because we might practice our backwards medicine on innocent Americans. Things got worse. I was cleaning the emergency department when a trauma came in. A severed finger. I watched the resident completely botch the initial assessment and my muscle memory, it took over. I stepped forward slightly. Clara shoved me back hard into a cart. "You think you know something about medicine?" she screamed. "You're a janitor. Your opinion is worth less than the dirt you mop up." She grabbed my badge, held it up. "This says custodial staff. You clean up blood and shit because that's all your worthless brain can process." She dragged me into the middle of the ER and started quizzing me on medical terms. "Do you know what a scalpel is, Ahmed? How about sutures?" When I stayed silent, humiliated, she turned to her students. "This is why education matters. Without it, you end up like him. Someone whose biggest achievement is figuring out which end of the mop goes on the floor." She grabbed my face and turned it toward the students like I was some kind of specimen. In his country, he probably lived in a mud hut. He should be grateful we even let him touch our garbage. But the final humiliation, the one that truly cut deep, came when Clara discovered my prayer mat in my locker. She held it up in the cafeteria during lunch rush, asking loudly if anyone wanted to check it for explosives. Then she threw it on the floor and stepped on it repeatedly, explaining that this was what American freedom looked like. She even used it to wipe up spilled soda while maintaining eye contact. Seeing my mat, a symbol of my faith and my home, disrespected like that, it cut like a scalpel. But then one day everything changed. I was wiping equipment in the trauma bay when the explosion hit. The sound shook the entire building. Then the screaming sirens, ambulance after ambulance. A chemical plant had exploded. 40 critical patients, burns, blast injuries, all flooding in. The ER turned to absolute chaos. 12 emergency physicians were instantly overwhelmed. Clara was shouting that they needed anyone with medical training, even veterinarians or dentists. I dropped my mop. I walked to the charge desk where Clara was panicking. I pulled out my phone and opened the documents I had saved there. My Syrian medical license, the letter from Damascus University Hospital, confirming my position as chief of trauma surgery. Clara's face went white as she read the credentials. Her hand shook as she saw my published papers on mass casualty events. I was chief of surgery at the largest trauma center in Syria, I said, my voice calm even as chaos swirled around us. I've handled over 300 mass casualty events from bombings. Unless you want these people to die while you verify my credentials, I suggest you let me help. Clara's mouth opened and closed without sound. She just stared at the screen, her brain struggling to comprehend that the man she'd called a primitive terrorist had more trauma surgery experience than anyone in the entire building. She held my phone for what felt like forever while burn victims screamed and more ambulances arrived. Her face went from shock to angry, then calculating as she read my papers. Her hands were shaking as another siren wailed closer. She shoved my phone back at me hard. You're lying, she hissed, but I could hear her voice crack. Just then, Dr. Thompson appeared next to us, covered in blood. Clara grabbed his arm and started telling him I was pretending to be a doctor with fake papers. He didn't even look at my phone. He just pointed at the trauma bay where 3 young residents were panicking over a patient who couldn't breathe. Can you intubate? He asked me. I nodded. Then do it. We'll sort credentials later. I pushed past Clara, walked fast to the gurney where Dr. Smith was fumbling with a laryngoscope, his whole body shaking as the monitor showed the patient's oxygen dropping fast. I took the scope from his hand smoothly, tilted the patient's head back, seeing past all the burns to find the anatomy I knew so well. The tube went in perfectly on my first try. The respiratory therapist hooked up the ventilator, and the numbers on the monitor immediately started going up. I moved to the next bay where nurses were yelling at each other about a man with burns covering almost half his body. They couldn't figure out how much fluid to give him. I grabbed a marker from the board and wrote out the Parkland formula calculations I'd done hundreds of times in Damascus. For milliliters times weight times percent burned, half in the first 8 hours. Dr. Thompson watched me write and simply nodded. Clara tried to follow me between the beds, telling every nurse and doctor not to listen to the janitor, but everyone was too busy saving lives to care what she said. I spotted swelling in a patient's arm that the residents had missed completely. Compartment syndrome. It needed immediate surgery or he'd lose the arm. Even Clara's favorite nurses started ignoring her when they saw I was right. Dr. Thompson grabbed the intercom and announced to the wholer that I was a visiting trauma surgeon helping with a mass casualty event and had temporary privileges. Clara's face turned dark purple as she watched me show the residents how to do triage using the START protocol I'd used in Syria for years. She just stood there helpless while I directed patient flow. Then the worst case arrived. A worker who'd been right next to the explosion came in. His airway burned so badly the residents froze. But I'd seen this exact injury from white phosphorus attacks back home. I grabbed the scalpel and made a quick cut in his throat for a surgical airway, explaining each step to Dr. Johnson, who watched with his mouth open. 3 hours into the crisis, Dr. Fatima Rashid was working next to me on a patient with shrapnel in his belly. She mentioned she Googled my name during a quick break. 300 mass casualty events? She asked quietly while we sutured. I just nodded and kept working. During a short break between patients, I pulled out my phone to text my son Malik that I'd be home late. My hand shook a little as the adrenaline started wearing off. He texted back immediately, asking if I was okay. He knew I hadn't done any surgery since we left Syria and worried this would bring back bad memories. When we had to take a patient up to surgery for internal bleeding, Clara physically blocked the doors with her body. Dr. Thompson pushed right past her. You're relieved of duty for interfering with emergency care, he told her. Security came and walked her to the administrative offices while she kept yelling that I was a fraud. In the OR, my hands remembered everything, even after 2 years of holding mops instead of scalpels. Dr. Thompson had a patient with a bad liver tear, and blood was pouring out faster than the nurses could keep up with suction. I reached for the retractor without being asked and pulled back tissue so he could see the bleeder. The nurse who used to walk past me in the halls without making eye contact now handed me clamps before I even asked for them. It was amazing how the body remembers important skills like that even after all that time. We worked for 40 minutes getting the bleeding under control while more trauma cases kept coming in. The patient's blood pressure finally stabilized, and Thompson nodded at me before we moved to the next surgery. Between operations, James Porter, A hospital executive showed up, still pulling on scrubs over his suit. He pulled me into the supply room and showed me his phone where he'd already looked up my papers from Damascus medical journals. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. I just told him nobody asked. They only saw a refugee with a mop. Porter stared at me for a second, then said the hospital would help with my license transfer immediately. We went back out to handle 3 more surgeries, including a teenager with internal bleeding and a construction worker with a crushed chest. By the time the last ambulance left, I'd been working for 16 straight hours, and my hands were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The next morning I sat in the empty cafeteria, still wearing the borrowed scrubs because I was too tired to change. Fatima found me there, staring at my coffee, and brought me a breakfast sandwich. She sat down across from me, and we didn't need to say anything because she understood what it meant to lose everything and start over. We both knew what it was like to have our skills mean nothing because of where we came from. Linda from Custodial Services found me later that morning and kept apologizing for never asking about my background. She said she always noticed how careful I was with the medical equipment, like I knew exactly what each piece did. I told her she was one of the only people who treated me like a human being instead of just the foreign janitor. That afternoon, Dr. Thompson called a big staff meeting in the main conference room. He stood up and told everyone how I'd helped save at least 12 people during the crisis. He announced the hospital would fast-track my license application and already had a position waiting for me once it went through. Clara had to sit there in the front row, staring at her shoes, while the nurses who used to laugh at her jokes about me shifted around, looking uncomfortable. Some of them even came up afterward to shake my hand and say they were sorry for how they'd acted. Clara waited until everyone else left, then cornered me in the hallway. "You tricked us," she hissed, her face red with anger. She said she'd file a complaint about me practicing without a license. I stayed calm and reminded her that Dr. Thompson gave me emergency privileges, which is completely legal during mass casualty events. Then I pulled out my phone, the same one she'd mocked me for using to watch surgery videos. "I have recordings of everything you said to me," I told her. Her face went white. She realized I'd been documenting her harassment the whole time. That evening, I went to my locker to finally change back into my janitor uniform. My prayer mat was still there, sticky with the soda Clara had poured on it. Fatima appeared with a new prayer mat she'd bought from the mosque gift shop downtown. She said, "Sometimes we need to let go of things that got ruined and accept what's offered with respect." I took the new mat and thanked her, then folded up the old one to throw away. 2 days later at home, Malik helped me fill out all the extra paperwork for my expedited license application. He mentioned his friends at school saw my name on the news coverage about the explosion response. For the first time since we came to America, he seemed proud instead of embarrassed that his dad was a refugee. He even asked me to tell him about the surgeries I did back in Damascus. I went back to work the next week, still officially a janitor while the paperwork went through the system. Everything felt different, though. Residents stopped me in the halls to ask medical questions while I pushed my mop cart. Nurses brought me coffee during my breaks and sat with me to talk about cases. Several doctors offered to write recommendation letters for my application. Even the security guards who used to watch me suspiciously now nodded with respect when I walked by. 3 weeks later, Clara came back from her administrative leave acting like nothing happened. She immediately started telling anyone who would listen that I was a security threat who infiltrated the hospital. She went to HR and filed a formal complaint, saying I committed fraud by not mentioning my medical background on my custodial application. She even claimed I was probably a terrorist spy, gathering information about American hospitals. HR scheduled a meeting for the next week where I sat across from the director while Clara stood by the door with her arms crossed. The director pulled out my custodial application and went through it line by line, asking me to confirm each answer. When she got to the work experience section, she pointed out that it specifically asked about American work history, which I didn't have when I applied. Clara kept interrupting to say that hiding my medical background was fraud, but the director told her to let me speak. I explained that I answered every question truthfully based on what they asked, and nowhere did the application require me to list foreign credentials for a janitor position. The director nodded and made notes while Clara's face got redder. She started yelling about how refugees couldn't be trusted, and how the hospital needed to run full background checks on anyone from the Middle East. The director told her that was enough and dismissed us both, saying she'd found no evidence of fraud in my application. That night, I stayed late to finish cleaning the surgical wing, and when I finally got to my car in the parking garage, all 4 tires had been slashed. The security booth was empty, and when I called the main desk, they said the cameras in that section had been down for maintenance since that afternoon. I stood there in the cold garage, knowing it was either Clara or someone who supported her. But without proof, I just called AAA and waited 2 hours for them to tow my car. The next morning, Dr. Williams found me cleaning the trauma bay and pulled me aside. He looked around to make sure no one was listening, then apologized for laughing at Clara's jokes about me eating terrorist food and not understanding complex English. He admitted he knew it was wrong, but Clara controlled resident evaluations and could tank his career with one bad review. He said if I needed someone to testify about her harassment, he'd do it, even if it meant risking his position. I thanked him and went back to mopping while he headed to rounds. Later that day, Fatima called me into an empty exam room and showed me her laptop screen. She'd been digging through the hospital's internal message board and found 3 fake accounts that were all posting about me. The accounts claimed I had ties to terrorist groups in Syria and that I was using my janitor job to case the hospital for an attack. She'd traced the IP addresses, and they all came from computers Clara had logged into. Fatima had already screenshotted everything and sent copies to HR and the legal department with a formal complaint about defamation and cyber harassment. 2 days later, during my afternoon shift, I was emptying trash in the nurse's station when I heard Clara on the phone in the next room. She was giving someone my full name and spelling it out slowly. Then I heard her say she had serious concerns about my immigration status and possible security threats. My blood went cold when she mentioned IC. Even though I had asylum and all my papers were legal, I knew how these investigations worked. People got detained for months while agents verified information. Families got torn apart. Lives got destroyed over false reports. I dropped the trash bag and walked straight to Porter's office, but his secretary said he was in meetings all day. The next morning, his secretary called and said I needed to come in immediately. When I walked into Porter's office, 2 agents in dark suits were sitting at his conference table with folders spread out. They asked me to sit down and started asking questions about when I arrived in America, how I got asylum, why I was working as a janitor, if I was really a doctor. For 2 hours, they went through every detail of my immigration case while Porter sat in the corner watching. I showed them all my documents on my phone, my asylum approval, my work permit, my pending medical license transfer application. They took photos of everything and said they'd need to verify it all with their databases. When they finally let me go, they said the investigation could take several months and might affect my license transfer since medical boards don't like approving people under federal investigation. Porter walked me to the door and apologized, saying the hospital would provide legal support, but I could see him doing the math on what this meant for the hospital's reputation. That night I told Malik about the IC agents and he went pale. He started pacing our small apartment, talking about other Syrian families who'd been detained for months over false reports. Kids separated from parents, people deported back to war zones. He begged me to consider moving to Canada where his cousin lived. He said we could start over again somewhere safer, but I was tired of running. We'd already lost our home in Damascus to bombs and militias, lost our careers, our friends, our whole life. I wasn't going to let Clara drive us out of another home. I told Malik we were staying and fighting this. The next few days at work were strange. Word had spread about the IC investigation, and everyone treated me differently. Not with the open disgust from before Clara knew I was a doctor, and not with the respect from after I'd saved lives during the explosion, but with that careful distance people keep from someone who might bring federal agents to their workplace. Nurses stopped making small talk. Doctors avoided eye contact. Even other custodial staff stayed away like I had something contagious. 3 days after the aita visit, Fatima found me during lunch and said she'd had enough. She'd started a petition supporting me and explaining Clara's harassment campaign. Within 24 hours, she had over 200 signatures from hospital staff, including several department heads and most of the residents who'd been there during the explosion. She printed it out and marched straight to Porter's office with a stack of papers. I watched through the glass doors as she put it on his desk and pointed at it while talking. Later, she told me she'd reminded him that Clara's actions had created a hostile work environment that exposed the hospital to major lawsuits, and that if they didn't act soon, she'd make sure the media knew about it. The next morning, I was eating my lunch in the cafeteria when Clara walked in and stopped right in front of my table. She raised her voice so everyone could hear and said, "Terrorists who hide their identities shouldn't be allowed near vulnerable patients." Dr. Thompson rushed over from across the room and told her one more outburst would mean termination. But several patient families sitting nearby had already heard everything. That afternoon, Linda from Custodial Services pulled me aside in the supply room and showed me a notebook she'd been keeping. She'd written down every single thing Clara had said to me for months, with dates and times and witnesses. She said she never spoke up before because, who would believe a janitor's supervisor over a head nurse? But now she wanted to help my case. A week into the IC investigation, I was praying on my new mat in the supply closet when the door opened. A young resident I'd seen around but never talked to came in and rolled out his own prayer mat next to mine. After we finished, he told me he'd been hiding his faith for years, but seeing me keep going despite everything gave him the courage to stop hiding. 3 days later, the local news ran a story about me after someone leaked it to them. The headline read, "Syrian refugee doctor saved lives during chemical plant explosion. Now under federal investigation." And the coverage made me look like a hero. Clara saw it and started telling everyone I was manipulating the media for sympathy, and that the story was probably fake. That same afternoon, my phone rang and it was Malik's school calling to say he'd been in a fight. Some kids had called me a terrorist, using the exact same words their parents who worked at the hospital had been saying. The principal suggested maybe Malik would do better in alternative education to avoid more incidents, which I knew meant they wanted to push him out. Dr. Thompson heard about it and actually drove to the school himself to pick Malik up. On the drive home, he apologized for how the hospital's failure to stop Clara had hurt my family. He mentioned his grandfather came from Poland as a refugee and faced discrimination too, though he admitted it wasn't the same as what we were dealing with. 2 weeks into the investigation, I got a letter from the state medical board saying they were fast-tracking my license review because of how I'd helped during the explosion. But they also said the IC investigation might delay final approval, and scheduled an interview where I'd have to show my medical knowledge and explain why I hadn't practiced for so long. At the interview, I answered every medical scenario they threw at me perfectly. But the board members kept asking about potential security concerns instead of medicine. One member actually asked if my medical training in Syria included biological weapons, which was so ridiculous, I laughed before explaining we were too busy treating victims of chemical attacks to create them. Driving home from that interview, I passed our mosque for Friday prayers and saw fresh graffiti sprayed on the wall that said, "Terrorists go home." I didn't stop to pray because I didn't want to bring more attention to our community, and I realized Clara's poison had spread way beyond just the hospital. Meanwhile, Fatima had been digging into Clara's background and found something interesting. Clara had been transferred from 2 other hospitals after complaints about harassing Filipino nurses and a Nigerian doctor. HR never knew about this pattern because hospitals usually just quietly transfer problem employees instead of firing them and dealing with lawsuits. The next morning, Porter's assistant called me to an emergency meeting, where I found the conference room packed with hospital executives and lawyers. Porter stood at the head of the table holding a letter while Clara sat in the corner trying to hide a smile. He explained that a patient's family had filed a formal complaint saying they didn't feel safe being treated at a hospital that employed potential terrorists. The letter specifically named me and demanded I be barred from the hospital until the IC investigation was finished. Porter's hand shook as he read the parts calling me a security threat, who might poison patients or plant bombs in the building. The family's lawyer had already contacted local news stations and threatened to go public if the hospital didn't take immediate action. Porter said he had no choice but to place me on paid administrative leave, effective immediately, while they investigated the complaint. Dr. Thompson jumped up from his chair and started arguing that this was ridiculous since I'd saved dozens of lives during the explosion. Porter cut him off, saying the hospital's liability insurance required them to remove any employee under federal investigation from patient care areas. Clara stood up and offered to walk me out to make sure I returned my badge and keys properly. The security guard followed us to my locker where I had to pack my things while Clara watched with her arms crossed. She whispered that, maybe now I'd understand this wasn't my country and never would be. I drove home in the middle of what should have been my shift and found Malik doing his chemistry homework at the kitchen table. I sat down and helped him with organic chemistry problems, the same ones I used to teach medical students in Damascus years ago. He asked if we made a mistake coming to America when people here hated us so much. I told him dignity wasn't about what others did to us, but how we chose to respond to it. That evening, Dr. Brown knocked on my apartment door, carrying a flash drive he'd hidden in his pocket. He plugged it into my laptop and showed me security footage from the parking garage he'd saved before it mysteriously disappeared. The grainy video clearly showed Clara near my car the night my tires were slashed, checking for cameras before ducking down. Brown said he was willing to testify, but worried about his residency position since Porter controlled the program. I spent the next day studying for the USMLE medical exams I'd need to practice medicine legally in America. Every knock at the door made my heart race, thinking it might be ICE agents coming to take me away. Malik had started sleeping badly, and I heard him get up multiple times each night to check the locks. He'd stopped inviting friends over and barely spoke at dinner anymore, just pushed food around his plate. 3 weeks into my leave, Fatima texted asking to meet at a coffee shop downtown with important news. She arrived with a folder full of statements from 12 nurses who'd come forward about Clara's harassment and discrimination. They'd been too scared before, but seeing her attack me so viciously gave them the courage to speak up. One nurse from the Philippines said Clara called her people dirty and backward, making her clean bedpans for months. Another from Kenya said Clara told her African brains weren't capable of understanding real medicine. A third from India said Clara made monkey sounds whenever she walked past. Fatima had recorded all their statements and compiled a timeline showing Clara's pattern went back 8 years. The most shocking evidence came from a nurse named Jennifer Park who'd secretly recorded Clara during staff meetings. Jennifer played me audio from her phone where Clara's voice was clear as she used racial slurs. In one recording, Clara talked about her plan to get rid of all the foreign infiltrators ruining American healthcare. She specifically mentioned targeting anyone from the Middle East first because they were the most dangerous. The recordings were from months before the explosion, proving Clara's harassment of me was planned, not reactive. Jennifer had kept recording after I was suspended and captured Clara bragging about finally getting me removed. The hospital's legal team finally took action after Fatima submitted all the evidence to them and threatened to go public. They launched a formal investigation into Clara's behavior, interviewing dozens of staff members over several days. The pattern that emerged was damning, with years of racist harassment hidden behind her position and influence. Nurses who'd been too scared to speak before now came forward with their own stories of Clara's abuse. The investigators found she'd driven out at least 6 foreign medical professionals over the past decade. One morning, Malik came into my room holding his phone with tears in his eyes, but also smiling. His classmate had posted a video on social media from the night of the chemical plant explosion. The shaky footage showed me working on patients in the trauma bay, while chaos swirled around us. The caption read, "This is what a real hero looks like." And it already had thousands of shares. Comments poured in from people calling me a hero and demanding the hospital reinstate me immediately. Some were from patients I'd saved that night who recognized themselves in the video. For the first time in weeks, I saw hope in Malik's face as he read the supportive messages. That small light in the darkness lasted exactly 3 days before everything got worse. At 6 o'clock in the morning, our apartment door shook with pounding that made Malik scream from his bedroom. I opened it to find 4 IC agents in tactical vests demanding entry for a routine check. They pushed past me and started searching through everything while Malik stood frozen in his pajamas watching. They dumped out drawers, flipped our mattresses, and went through every book and paper in the apartment. One agent found my Arabic medical journals and held them up like evidence of something sinister. They confiscated all of them for translation and review, even though I explained they were just medical texts. Malik's hands shook as they photographed all our documents and asked him questions about our daily activities. The search lasted 3 hours while neighbors watched from their doorways and whispered about the terrorist family getting what they deserved. They left with boxes of our belongings, including my medical certificates and Malik's school projects about Syria. The apartment looked like a tornado hit it, with furniture overturned and drawers emptied everywhere. Malik helped me clean up in silence, his face pale as he picked up torn photos and scattered papers. For weeks after that, he barely spoke and jumped at every knock on the door. The investigation dragged on with no updates from anyone at the hospital or ICE. I spent my days applying for jobs at grocery stores and gas stations, anything to pay rent while my medical career hung in limbo. 1 month into this nightmare, a thick envelope arrived from the state medical board. My hands trembled as I opened it and read that they'd approved my medical license after reviewing my credentials and experience. The approval meant nothing though, since the letter's second page explained I couldn't practice until ICE cleared their investigation. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my approved license, qualified to save lives, but legally banned from touching a patient. That afternoon, Linda showed up at my door with a chocolate cake she'd baked in stories from the hospital. She hugged me tight and said the whole custodial staff missed me, especially since Clara had turned into a complete nightmare. Linda explained how Clara now demanded they clean her personal office twice every day, screaming at them over invisible dust specks. Clara threatened to fire anyone who didn't scrub her floor on their hands and knees while she watched. The other janitors were looking for new jobs because Clara's harassment had gotten so bad since I left. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with an urgent text from Dr. Thompson about a massive pileup on I-75. 18 cars had crashed in fog, with dozens of critical patients coming in and not enough doctors. He said he'd take full responsibility if I came to help. That lives mattered more than bureaucracy. I sat in my car outside the hospital for 10 minutes, engine running, weighing everything. My immigration case could be destroyed if I went inside, but people were dying while I sat there. I thought about all the trauma victims I'd saved in Damascus, and how I'd sworn an oath to help anyone who needed it. My hands moved on their own, turning off the engine and grabbing my old scrubs from the back seat. I entered through the ER's back door, wearing scrubs that still had my name embroidered on them. The chaos hit me immediately. Nurses running between gurneys, blood on the floor. I went straight to the worst cases and started triaging, my hands remembering exactly what to do. A teenager with a crushed chest needed immediate attention, so I began working while nurses rushed to help. Clara's voice cut through the noise like a knife when she spotted me from across the room. She started screaming about calling security, pointing at me and yelling that I was trespassing on hospital property. Dr. Thompson stepped between us and told her to either help save lives or get out of his ER. Clara chose to leave, but not before pulling out her phone and taking multiple photos of me working. She kept shouting about felony trespassing and how I'd violated federal orders while patients bled around us. I ignored her and kept working, suturing a deep head wound on a businessman who'd been trapped in his car. The man was conscious and watching as I worked to stop the bleeding and assess his other injuries. Porter appeared 20 minutes later with 2 security guards and 2 police officers behind him. Clara had called them, claiming I was violating my administrative leave and endangering patients by practicing without authorization. The officers looked uncomfortable as they approached me, while I was literally holding a needle in someone's skin. They apologized but said they had to escort me out immediately, regardless of the circumstances. The businessman I was treating grabbed Porter's arm and demanded to know why they were removing the doctor saving his life. Porter explained about the investigation and administrative leave, while the patient's blood soaked through the temporary bandage. The businessman said he'd be calling his lawyers about a hospital that valued paperwork over patient care. He took Porter's business card and promised this wouldn't be the end of the conversation. The officers walked me out through the main entrance where more patients were still arriving from the accident. Nurses stared in shock as I was escorted past bleeding victims who needed help I wasn't allowed to give. The next evening, the local news led with footage someone had taken of me being removed from the ER. The headline read, "Hospital removes Syrian doctor during emergency while under investigation," with video of officers walking me past injured patients. Social media exploded within hours with hashtags demanding my reinstatement and calling the hospital's actions criminal. People shared stories about how I'd saved their family members during the chemical plant explosion. Comments poured in, calling for boycotts of the hospital until they brought me back. Malik came home from school the next day more energized than I'd seen him in weeks. His classmates had organized a walkout in support of me, with over 200 students participating. Even teachers had joined them, standing outside with signs reading, "Ahmed saved lives and stop punishing heroes." He showed me photos on his phone of teenagers holding posters with my picture, and "Let him work" written in bold letters. The principal had tried to stop them, but backed down when parents started showing up to support their kids. That evening, Fatima called with shocking news from a contact she developed inside IC. A whistleblower agent had reached out to say there was never any real investigation into me at all. Clara's report had been flagged as malicious and closed within 3 days of being filed. The agent said no one had bothered to inform the hospital that the investigation was already over. He suggested we file a Freedom of Information Act request to get the official records proving Clara had lied. The next morning, Porter called an emergency board meeting that Clara was required to attend. I heard from Linda that Clara showed up confident until Porter presented the IC documentation, showing no active investigation existed. The board voted unanimously to suspend Clara, pending their own investigation into her false reports and harassment. Clara left the meeting screaming that the hospital was choosing terrorists over patriots and real Americans. She threatened to go to conservative media outlets with her story about foreign doctors taking over American hospitals. 6 weeks dragged by with my family living off savings and donated food from the mosque while Clara kept making the rounds on every podcast that would have her. The businessman whose life I'd saved during the pileup called one morning to say he'd hired David Steinberg, some big-shot civil rights lawyer who wanted to take my case for free. David came to our apartment with 3 boxes of files and spent 4 hours going through every text, email, and security video from the hospital. He kept shaking his head and writing notes about defamation, discrimination, and something called intentional infliction of emotional distress. That same week, I saw Linda post a link to Clara on some right-wing podcast with 2 million subscribers where she sat there for an hour, claiming she was the real victim. She told the host she'd been fired for trying to protect patients from a potential radical who'd lied about his background. The host just nodded along while she made up stories about me refusing to follow hospital protocols and praying in patient rooms. The video got shared everywhere, with comments about how liberals were destroying America by letting terrorists work in hospitals. Dr. Davis saw the podcast and posted his own video on social media showing my actual credentials, and talking about how I'd saved 43 lives during the explosion. Clara's supporters flooded his page, calling him a traitor and terrorist sympathizer. But he kept the video up and posted more evidence every day. The FOIA request David filed finally came back, showing IC had closed my case after just 48 hours with a finding of no credible threat. The delay in telling anyone was marked as administrative backlog, which David said proved the hospital let Clara keep harassing me, even though they knew the investigation was over. Clara must have gotten desperate because she went on another podcast and started talking about my supposed PTSD from Syria that made me dangerous to patients. She claimed she'd seen my medical records showing mental health issues, which was completely made up since I'd never been treated for anything like that. David immediately filed complaints with the state about HIPAA violations and got a restraining order keeping Clara from talking about me publicly. 2 months after the explosion, the mail carrier knocked with a certified letter from the state medical board. My hand shook opening it until I saw the words "full medical license granted" at the top of the page. That same afternoon, Malik ran in from school, waving his acceptance letter to the advanced science program he'd been dreaming about for months. We actually smiled for the first time in weeks, and Fatima made her special lamb dish to celebrate. The next morning, Linda texted that Porter had just announced his resignation, effective immediately. Someone leaked his resignation letter where the board basically forced him out for mishandling my situation and creating liability for the hospital. The interim CEO called me an hour later, offering full reinstatement as an attending physician with back pay and a formal public apology. I accepted, but knew going back wouldn't be simple. My first day back, Clara's remaining supporters had organized a protest at the main entrance, with signs saying the hospital was surrendering to terrorism and choosing foreigners over Americans. Security had to bring me through the loading dock while protesters screamed about Sharia law taking over healthcare. The residents who'd laughed at Clara's jokes about me were all on my service that first week. They called me Dr. Ahmed now and followed my orders, but I could see them struggling with how to act around someone they'd watched mop their messes for months. During rounds they'd start to make comments, then catch themselves and go quiet. One kept staring at my hands like he couldn't believe they belonged to a surgeon. On my third day back, I went to the break room for coffee and found my old mop and bucket sitting in the corner. Linda had saved them and left a note saying she thought I might want to see how far I'd come. I picked up the mop handle and felt the worn spots where my hands had gripped it for months while Clara humiliated me. The same hands that had saved over 1,000 lives in Damascus had pushed this mop while people called me worthless. Standing there holding it, I realized the title of doctor didn't erase what happened, and probably never would. 3 weeks later, I was reviewing patient charts when my phone buzzed with a news alert that made me drop everything. The local news showed Clara's house surrounded by federal agents in dark jackets with FBI printed on the back. They walked up her driveway while neighbors stood on their lawns recording with their phones. Clara opened her door wearing pajamas, and the agent showed her papers while speaking words I couldn't hear through the TV. She started screaming and pointing at the camera, her face red and twisted. 2 agents turned her around and put handcuffs on her wrists, while she kept yelling about protecting America from people like me. The news reporter explained she faced charges for cyberstalking, criminal harassment, and making false reports to federal agencies about hospital staff. They led her to a black SUV while she screamed that terrorists had taken over the medical system. 1 week later, the hospital called a mandatory meeting for all staff in the main auditorium. The new chief of staff stood at the front, talking about diversity and respect while everyone sat silent. 3 nurses from Clara's unit started crying during the presentation. One of them found me afterward in the hallway and grabbed my arm. She said she was sorry for staying quiet when Clara hurt me, that she was scared of losing her job, but knew that wasn't an excuse. 2 more nurses came over and said the same thing, their eyes red and puffy. The diversity trainer brought in stories from other hospitals where the same thing happened to immigrant doctors and nurses. People shifted in their seats when she described how silence made them all guilty of letting it happen. That afternoon, Malik walked through the hospital doors for the first time since I got my medical license back. He watched me teaching residents in the conference room, showing them the same trauma techniques I taught in Damascus. His eyes got watery when he saw me drawing diagrams on the whiteboard just like I used to do in Syria. After the residents left, he hugged me tight and said we didn't lose everything when we left home. He said, "We carried our knowledge and dignity with us, even when people tried to take it away." During Clara's trial preparation, investigators found her laptop full of screenshots from an online group called Patriots Against Foreign Doctors. The FBI agent told me she'd been posting about me for months, sharing my photo and work schedule with other members. They found similar posts about immigrant healthcare workers at 3 other hospitals where she'd worked before. She'd been doing this for years, moving from hospital to hospital when her behavior got too obvious. The prosecutor showed me messages where Clara planned with others to file false reports about foreign doctors to get them deported. 2 weeks later, I sat in the witness chair at the federal courthouse downtown. Clara stared at me from the defense table, her lips pressed into a thin line. The prosecutor asked me to describe the prayer mat incident, and I told the court how she threw it on the floor and stepped on it. I explained how she filed the false IC report that almost got my family deported. I kept my voice steady and professional, just stating facts without getting emotional. Clara's lawyer stood up for cross-examination and tried to make me look bad. He asked if I'd hidden my medical background from the hospital when I applied for the janitor job. I explained that I never hid anything, but simply took the only work available while my credentials were being verified. He asked why I didn't tell Clara I was a doctor, and I said she never asked. She just assumed I was stupid. The lawyer suggested I was trying to trick people, but the judge told him to move on. 3 days later, the jury came back with their verdict after only 2 hours of discussion. The judge read that they found Clara guilty on all federal charges, including making false reports to ICE. Clara's face went white, and she gripped the table so hard her knuckles turned pale. The judge said she faced up to 5 years in federal prison for the false reporting charges alone. Clara stood up and collapsed, her lawyer catching her before she hit the floor. Court officers helped her to a chair while she kept saying this couldn't be happening. That evening, I met Fatima in the hospital cafeteria to break our Ramadan fast together. She brought dates and water, the traditional way to break fast, and we sat at a regular table instead of hiding. She told me my patience through everything inspired her to stop hiding her faith at work. We prayed together right there in the cafeteria, not caring who saw us. Other Muslim staff members came over and joined us, something that never would have happened when Clara was there. But even with Clara gone and facing prison, I still felt the damage she'd done deep in my bones. Every time I heard sirens, I checked my rearview mirror, thinking IC was coming. When someone stared at my hospital badge too long, my heart started racing. I woke up at night sometimes thinking I heard her voice in the hallway. The trauma didn't disappear just because justice happened. It lived inside me like a wound that wouldn't fully heal. The next week, the hospital board called me into a meeting about my future there. They offered me a position as head of trauma education, and a chance to share my story publicly. They wanted me to speak at conferences about refugee doctors and the barriers we face. I knew that taking the position would make me visible, possibly a target for people like Clara's online group. But I also thought about other refugee doctors and nurses hiding their backgrounds, afraid to speak up. I accepted the position, knowing that my visibility might help someone else feel less alone in their struggle. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my new office when the envelope appeared under my door. No return address, just my name written in block letters. Inside were photos from Damascus, my family at our old house before the bombs, my wife in her garden, my children playing in the courtyard we'd lost. The message was typed on plain paper. We know who you really are. My hands started shaking, but not from fear, from pure rage that even after everything, these people wouldn't stop. I called hospital security immediately, and they came within minutes, taking the envelope with gloves while asking if I'd noticed anyone suspicious. The head of security looked at the photos and immediately called the FBI agent who'd been handling Clara's case. Over the next 6 months, they traced the letter through fingerprints and surveillance footage to a nurse in pediatrics who'd been part of Clara's online group. She'd downloaded my refugee file from the hospital system 2 days before sending the letter. Security escorted her out that afternoon, while she screamed about protecting America from terrorists. The FBI added her name to their investigation of Clara's network, which had grown to include 17 healthcare workers across 3 states. I used my settlement money from the hospital to start a fund for refugee doctors and nurses trying to get their credentials transferred. The first person we helped was a Ukrainian surgeon named Oksana, who'd been driving Uber for 18 months while her paperwork sat in bureaucratic limbo. She cried when we covered her exam fees and helped her navigate the system that had almost broken her. The State Medical Association called me 4 months later about their humanitarian award ceremony. They wanted to honor me for my actions during the explosion, but I could feel Clara's absence in every word they didn't say about why their previous board member wasn't presenting the award. Standing at that podium, looking at 500 doctors who now knew my story, felt surreal after spending months invisible in their hallways. Linda's retirement party came 2 months after that. She pulled me aside near the cake table and laughed about how she'd always wondered why I handled surgical instruments like I'd been born holding them. We both knew she was one of the only people who'd seen me as human when everyone else saw a mop. Clara's sentencing happened on a Tuesday morning, 8 months after the explosion. She stood in an orange jumpsuit and allocated for 40 minutes, naming every person in her network who targeted immigrant healthcare workers. Her lawyer had negotiated it down to 3 years in exchange for her cooperation, but she'd have to register as a hate crime offender for life. The prosecutor read her messages aloud, including one where she bragged about destroying my career before it could restart. 2 weeks later, I scrubbed in for my first solo surgery at the hospital where I'd mopped blood 8 months earlier. The same were nurses who'd laughed at Clara's jokes now called me doctor with genuine respect, while I repaired a liver laceration that reminded me of 100 others I'd fixed in Damascus. My son Malik got his acceptance letter to the pre-med program on a Thursday. He brought it to my office and said he wanted to be like me. Not the surgeon who'd run a trauma center, but the man who'd kept his dignity while people tried to strip it away. The revelation came during my deposition for the civil case when the lawyer showed me Clara's computer records. She'd accessed my refugee file 3 weeks before she'd started harassing me. She'd read about my position in Damascus. She'd seen my published papers on trauma surgery. Every humiliation, every cruel word, had been calculated to keep me from returning to medicine, to make me quit before my credentials transferred. The hospital's new CEO announced the changes at a press conference with news cameras and reporters. Mandatory bias training for all staff, anonymous reporting systems that actually worked, and a program to help refugee physicians integrate into American healthcare. They wanted to name it after me, but I asked them to just call it the Dignity Initiative because that's all any of us really wanted. The news about Clara's insurance company refusing to cover her legal fees came through my lawyer 3 weeks later, while I was reviewing patient charts in my new office. They said criminal harassment wasn't covered under malpractice policies, leaving her to pay for everything herself. Within 2 months, she'd filed for bankruptcy, and the house she'd always bragged about went into foreclosure. The lawyer handling her case told me she'd moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the south side, the same neighborhood where most of the hospital's immigrant workers lived. I didn't feel happy about it exactly, but there was something right about her losing the things she'd used to feel superior to people like me. A whole year passed before the anniversary of the chemical plant explosion rolled around. The hospital organized a reunion for the survivors in the main auditorium, and I watched from the back as families hugged each other and cried. Then the businessman I'd treated before security dragged me out took the microphone. He told everyone how I'd saved his life that day, how the tourniquet I'd applied kept him from bleeding out while waiting for proper treatment. He announced a $1 million donation to start a fund helping refugee doctors get their credentials transferred, naming it after me, even though I'd asked him not to. 3 days after the reunion, I was walking through the hospital when I heard someone crying in the supply closet. Inside, I found a young Syrian man in a housekeeping uniform holding his phone with shaking hands. I sat down next to him and asked in Arabic what was wrong. His whole body jerked when he heard his language, and he started sobbing harder, telling me his family was still in Aleppo and he couldn't get them out. We talked for an hour about Damascus and the smell of jasmine in the old city and how American bread never tasted right. I gave him my number and told him I'd help him navigate the credential transfer process, since he'd been an anesthesiologist back home. The FBI agent called me during round 6 weeks later to tell me Clara's case had blown open something bigger. They'd arrested 23 people across 4 states, all part of a network targeting immigrant healthcare workers. The prosecutor said our case gave them the evidence they needed to prove a pattern of conspiracy. She told me we probably saved dozens of careers, maybe hundreds, from people who would have been pushed out of medicine by this group. Dr. Miller found me in the cafeteria the next week to tell me about his new policy as chief resident. Every resident would now spend 1 full day each month working alongside custodial and food service staff, not observing but actually doing the work. He said he wanted them to understand that everyone in the hospital deserved respect, that titles were just labels that could change but dignity was permanent. I still went to the supply closet for lunch sometimes, even though I had a proper office now. The other janitors started joining me there, bringing food from their countries and sharing stories about what they'd left behind. There was a Ukrainian woman who'd been a judge, a Somali man who'd run 3 schools, an Afghan guy who'd been a civil engineer. We'd sit on the floor, eating and remembering who we used to be before America taught us we were just the people who cleaned up messes. Malik's graduation came at the end of May, and I sat in the auditorium watching my son walk across the stage as valedictorian. In his speech, he talked about watching his father go from chief of surgery to janitor to doctor again. How it taught him that dignity came from inside, not from what others thought of you. I noticed several hospital staff in the audience, including some nurses who'd laughed at Clara's jokes about me. They couldn't look me in the eye afterward. Fatima and I started the support group 2 months later, meeting monthly in the same conference room where Clara had once made me stand while she mocked my accent. We had 15 people at the first meeting, All immigrant healthcare workers dealing with credential transfers or discrimination. By the third meeting we had 40. We shared resources and contacts, but mostly we just talked in our own languages about our struggles, reclaiming that space where we'd been humiliated. The letter from Clara arrived 18 months after the explosion, forwarded through my lawyer from the federal prison where she was serving her sentence. She didn't apologize or admit she was wrong. Instead, she asked if I'd write a letter supporting her early release, saying she'd learned her lesson and wanted to move forward. I read it once, then threw it in the trash. Forgiveness didn't mean I had to help someone who still couldn't say sorry. The morning I taught my first class as director of trauma surgery, I stood in the same trauma bay where I dropped my mop almost 2 years earlier. My ID badge had my full title now, but I kept my old janitor badge in my pocket as a reminder. When the new custodian came in to clean between cases, I greeted him in Spanish and asked about his kids, making sure he knew I saw him as a person, not just the guy with a mop. He smiled and told me about his daughter getting into nursing school. After he left, I turned to the residents and started teaching them about mass casualty triage, the same skills that had saved 43 lives the day everything changed.